in our fiction unit, and we're going to talk about two concepts of fiction, but mostly writing and then element of fiction. And one is imagery, which applies to all writing, really, and character. All right. So consider the following sentences. Here is an abstract, what we would consider an abstract sentence, something hard to define. Americans must be willing to protect our freedoms. Now consider that sentence for a moment. What could it mean, right? Americans. Who? In what way should be we willing to protect? What does it mean to protect a freedom? And what does freedom really mean, right? Now, if we were to translate this into more concrete terms, it might sound something like voters must be willing to give up some individual protections against wiretapping so that the government can track down terrorists and protect the nation as a whole. Some of you might be surprised. You know, maybe that was not what you had in mind with the first sentence, right? But now that there are more specific terms involved, now maybe things might seem a little questionable, or maybe you agree even more. Now let's take for another example of turning something abstract into concrete. Americans must be willing to protect our freedoms. Interesting. We've got the same sentence. Now here it is in different concrete terms. Voters must protect their Fourth Amendment right against illegal searches and seizures by calling or writing their representatives to protest the administration's warrantless wiretapping program. Note how the abstract sentence did not change, but when it became concrete, those two examples were the complete opposite of each other, yet the abstract sentence is the same. Politicians love to use this tactic, right? They'll make a broad statement about something that can be easily agreed with, right? And sometimes hard to disagree with. But when you read the fine print, you start to realize that it all comes down to interpretation. So let's take this following example. Imagine somebody says, let's go out for dessert. All right. If you yourself said this to your family or your friends, and you said it out loud, if you said, let's go out for dessert, what dessert would you choose? What would you have in mind? What is going through your head when you say dessert? What would you be thinking of? Now, what if your mom said, let's go out for dessert? What dessert would she choose? Would it be the same as yours? Right? If mom said it, would you be excited or would you be disappointed? Right? Do you wish maybe you had said it first so you could decide the dessert? How about your dad or your best friend? Right? So the word dessert is very abstract, and what it means to you may not be what it means to someone else. Okay? So when we write in abstract terms, the reader is a little confused. They don't quite know what you mean. Or at the same time, they will impose their own understanding of this into the writing. So if I said, let's go out for dessert, I would probably be thinking of cake, right? Or some kind of pastry, right? And if my husband said it, he would mean ice cream, right? So I have a different image in my head. And when I say dessert, my husband or whoever else is thinking would be able to impose what they consider that dessert to be. And as writers, our job is to try to control the story or the movie going on in the reader's head. And if we're too abstract, the reader will either impose their own understanding and then it may not work in the story. They get confused later when they learn that they were wrong, right? Or they can't see anything at all. And then you don't activate that kind of movie in their head that we're trying to achieve in fiction. So again, look at all of these options, right? Everybody interprets language a little bit differently. right? When I say dessert, you will have a different image in your head than I will have, right? If I say think of a dog, the dog that you are thinking of is not the same that I am thinking of. You have a historical association to a dog. Perhaps you own a dog and that's the dog you're thinking of, a dachshund or a husky. Whereas I'm thinking of the dog that chased me down the street or lunged at me when I was running by. I'm a cat lady, right? So if you say, I love my dog, I'm thinking, well, what kind of owner are you? Right? Whereas when I say I love my cat, you might be reacting with, oh, cats. Well, your cat doesn't love you back, right? So we would need to be more specific to control the feelings and the thoughts and the way that our reader is going to interpret what they're reading. Okay, so here's another activity to kind of bring this home. What does it mean to treat every day like it's your birthday? Just ask yourself, if you were to treat every day like it was your birthday, what would we do every day? Usually when we hear this phrase, we think maybe, oh, you just treat it like it's a party or have fun. But if we take it literally and we boil it down to the person saying it, we can, if we know a lot about that person, we can actually define what that means to that person. So it's dependent upon maybe a character. When they say something, the more we know about that character, the more we can kind of guess what they mean. Or you are, bound by the character that you've created, right? So they would have to follow through in the way that they themselves would act. For example, Harry Potter. If Harry Potter at this age, right, because he gets older and his ideas of what he would do on his birthday would change. But I believe this was his first year at Hogwarts, right? And if he were to treat every day like it was his birthday, what would they be doing every day? There would be loads of candy every day. Right? It would be just like the hall, all this cake and sweets, man. But if we did it every day, oh my gosh, we'd all gain a lot of weight and we would get sick of cake and ice cream and those Bernie Bott's beans, I think they were called, right? So it's dependent upon who we know about the person as well, based on what they say. Now, take, for example, Santa Claus. What does Santa Claus do on his birthday? Right? One could argue he gives gifts away every day, but then that's Christmas. Maybe that he's at work, right? So if we were to treat every day like it's his birthday, maybe we would just sit around all day and not do anything and take a break because we're so busy the rest of the year making presents. Oprah. How would we treat every day like it was her birthday? Well, she would probably give a car away every single day, right? She'd go broke. The Rock, what would he do? I don't know, work out every day. Or Mark Zuckerberg, what would he do every day? Make lots of money, I suppose. I'm actually not sure what he would do every day. But note how it would be completely different. The meaning of this phrase changes dramatically depending on who we're talking about. So with that said, you want to be very detailed. You want to invoke all of the senses that you can in your writing so that the reader can see, feel, touch, smell, taste what's happening, and you can kind of activate that movie in their head that we're going for. Okay. So let's work on this a little bit and incorporating the 5 senses into our writing. These examples come from Janet Burroway's imaginative writing, and I have linked this chapter to Canvas, and you can access that, and it's part of one of your journals if you choose to do the journal. Okay, so close impressions equal vivid writing. Information taken in through the 5 senses is processed in the limbic system of the brain, which generates sensuous responses in the body, such as heart rate, blood and oxygen flow, muscle reactions, and so forth. Emotional response consists of these psychological reactions. So in order to have an effect on your reader's emotions, you must literally get into the limbic system, which you can only do through the senses. Okay, so again, imagine maybe a story that you really enjoy. And, Harry Potter is a common one because most kids have read it, right? J.K. Rowling was very good at creating like a movie in our heads when we read. We could see everything and feel it and smell it, and we became very attached to these characters, right? Well, she did this by making the writing very vivid. In her descriptions of Diagon Alley and Hogwarts, we were transported. And when we read a story like that, that's very successful writing. And that's kind of what you want to do in a piece of fiction. That's why people read fiction. Okay. If you want to know more about the brain and how it reacts to when it reads, you can go to that link here on the limbic system and learn more about it there. And then here, there's a podcast called "This Is Your Brain on Metaphor," and it is an episode on the Spectrum broadcast, and it actually explains the processes that your brain goes through when it is decoding language and imagery. Okay. So whenever we write something, it's a relationship you're establishing with not just yourself, but the reader, right? Like in order for it to be effective, the writer can't just write for oneself because it's meant to be read, right? So it's a relationship here between the reader and the writer. Readers actively bring their own memories and experience to what they read. Words not only denote or literally refer to their meaning, but connote, suggest, or imply through layers of connection in our experience and culture. Often using the imagery of one sense will suggest the other senses as well and will resonate with ideas, qualities, and emotions. Okay, so take the following images, right? Each of them kind of activate different emotional reactions in you or your reader, right? Because we've lived a life. When I read, I'm bringing all of my past experiences to what I'm reading to decode the language, right? Now, some are relatively universal. Okay, for example, if we take the teddy bear above, it definitely activates something dealing with childhood because most people have had experience with stuffed animals growing up and these fluffy things being our friends. Okay. The single rose, that usually means something about love or passion, and I would argue some of that is artificial advertising, but also in school they would tell you that when you read that in literature, this is what it means. I would try not to think about that so much, like if this exists in a story it must mean this, because every writer can determine, right? If they work at it, they can make the rose mean something very different. It doesn't have to always mean love. It could actually mean something quite sinister if they want it to be that way and they build it that way. So I would warn people against cookie cutter, ideas that white always means purity. It doesn't always mean that. So next to the rose, you've got a piece of jewelry, but this is an antique jewelry. So if this was maybe, costume tacky jewelry, then it would mean one thing, right? But this jewelry, represents something a much more specific. It kind of takes us back historically. Just like on the left, we have this picture of this very old picture, right? That comes with a set of associations that we all kind of have. The old typewriter, an old car abandoned in the forest, whereas there's this really fancy car, and it might actually be the same car, only one is in one different state than another. You've got, the vacation out on the beach that comes with a set of sensations, martini glass, a barn, a video game, family cooking together, right? And note how, you are familiar with your emotions being played with by advertising, because a lot of these images might actually come from an advertisement, or you're used to that where advertisings will play on our associations with ideas and concepts and images, right? Well, as a writer, you have access to that same tactic, and you may use it to your benefit when you include more imagery in your writing. Okay, so if you have a pen and paper handy, this is a very illuminating activity that can help you understand how, certain images or the imagery that you create in your writing, activate certain associations in people's, prejudices even. So for a moment, maybe a couple minutes, get a pen and paper and brainstorm the qualities of the owner of each of these cars. What is the qualities of the person who owns this Hummer? Who do you think would own this Hummer, right? Would you own one? Right? Maybe you go, oh, no, no, I don't want that part of my identity. Or some people are like, heck yeah, this is an awesome car. Who is the person that would go out and buy that particular Hummer that's yellow, looks brand new, also not quite parked correctly in a parking space? So if you just spend a few moments, what do you think are the qualities of this person? Alternatively, when you switch over to the other car, who do you think owns this bug, right? You look at the eyelashes, you got the lips on there. There's a little bow. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a bow at the top of the roof, right? Go ahead and brainstorm the qualities of that owner. Now take a step back when you look at these qualities and ask yourself, how did you know all of this stuff about these people? Even though you don't know, maybe you don't even know somebody who owns a Hummer or owns a bug, right? This is the power of imagery or using the senses. The person who drives the Hummer is a very different person that drives the bug. And in your story, if someone's driving a car, you may not say, Susan hopped into her car and drove down the street to the store. You might say she hopped into her yellow Hummer, right? She just bought at the dealership last week, right? That is activating lots of emotional responses in the reader when they can see the car. Now they can kind of impose some judgment, or they can start associating qualities with your main character. Whereas if Susan, your character, hopped into this bug, right? That's a very different story, right? How she acts, all of those things, people are going to bring their experience and impose them on the person you've created based on the details that are associated with that person. One might say, well, then I don't want them to have that, so I won't get specific. But at that point, they close the story because they can't see your character or understand them. So you just have to be careful with the details you include, but you do have to include lots of details. So here is an example of some very vivid writing, something that activates the 5 senses in the reader. Okay. This is from Annie Dillard's From Heaven and Earth in Jest. And this is actually creative nonfiction. And we will be talking about creative nonfiction later on in the course, which would include, essays and personal essays and memoir. These are things that have actually happened. But this genre, creative nonfiction, borrows a lot from fiction. Right? A lot of the rules from fiction do apply to creative nonfiction, which is why we talk about fiction first, and then we move on to creative nonfiction and kind of borrow from the lessons that we've learned. So even though that this is nonfiction, it's still following the rules of fiction, especially in terms of using the, vivid imagery in writing. A couple of summers ago, I was walking along the edge of the island to see what I could see in the water, and mainly to scare frogs. Frogs have an inelegant way of taking off from invisible positions on the bank just ahead of your feet, in dire panic, emitting a froggy yike and splashing into the water. Incredibly, this amused me, and incredibly, it amuses me still. As I walked along the grassy edge of the island, I got better and better at seeing frogs both in and out of the water. I learned to recognize, slowing down, the difference in texture of the light reflected from mudbank, water, grass, or frog. Frogs were flying all around me. At the end of the island, I noticed a small green frog. He was exactly half in and half out of the water, looking at like a schematic diagram of an amphibian, and he didn't jump. He didn't jump. I crept closer. At last, I knelt on the island's water-killed grass, lost, dumbstruck, staring at the frog in the creek just 4 feet away. He was a very small frog with wide, dull eyes. And just as I looked at him, he slowly crumpled and began to sag. The spirit vanished from his eyes as if snuffed. His skin emptied and drooped. His very skull seemed to collapse and settle like a kicked tent. He was shrinking before my eyes like a deflated football. I watched the taut, glistening skin on his shoulders ruck and rumble and fall. Soon, a part of his skin, formless as a pricked balloon, lay in floating folds like bright scum on top of water. It was a monstrous and terrifying thing. I gaped and bewildered, appalled. An oval shape hung in the water behind the drained frog. Then the shadow glided away. The frog skin bag started to sink. I had read about the giant water bug, but never seen one. Giant water bug is really the name of the creature, which is an enormous, heavy-bodied brown beetle. It eats insects, tadpoles, fish, and frogs. Its grasping forelegs are mighty and hooked inward. It seizes a victim with these legs, hugs it tight, and paralyzes it with enzymes injected during a vicious bite. That one bite is the only bite it ever takes. Through the puncture shoot the poisons that dissolve the victim's muscles and bones and organs, all but the skin. And through it, the giant water bug sucks out the victim's body, reduced to a juice. This event is quite common in warm, fresh water. The frog I saw was being sucked by a giant water bug. I had been kneeling on the island grass when the unrecognizable flap of frog skin settled on the creek bottom, swaying. I stood up and brushed the knees of my pants. I couldn't catch my breath. Now you're all disturbed. Look at the images she placed in your brain. But it's amazing writing, right? You could see all of this play out. You were there with her, watching the frogs jump around, and you had this emotional response, perhaps of delight. Oh, it's fun. Yikes, they're jumping and having fun, and it's almost silly, right? And then the camera starts to panel closer to this one specific frog, right? His little eyes are hopped over the water, and you're like, okay, I've kind of seen this image before in the media, right? But you're seeing it for real. And then it starts to collapse in this very messed up, horrific way. And it's so specific. You could see every little thing happening. And suddenly your delight turns to horror, right? And then the narrator kind of takes the step back, almost like panels out again, right, with the camera. When Annie Dillard gets a little technical about what is this water bug, but then the camera panels in again so that we actually see the water bug and we can see what happened to the frog and how the water bug eats its victim. Right? This is the power of detail, of activating the senses. Okay. For example, she says, his skin emptied and drooped. Right? If you just said he crumpled and that's all you said, we would get an image, but it's not the same. It's so specific, emptied and drooped. There's a very specific image in her head from that vocabulary. Right? An oval shadow hung in the water. Right? That, it's not just a shadow, but an oval shadow. It hung in the water. It didn't just, sink in the water. It's doing a very specific thing. It's being very precise. So when we're writing and we're using imagery, invoking the five senses, it's not just random imagery. We want to be precise. We want to create a very specific image in the reader's head and have them experience things very specifically. As writers, we kind of become control freaks in this sense, right? We're constantly trying to control what the reader's thinking. Now we will not be able to control everything, right? You cannot control everything the reader is thinking, but you do try as much as you can, because if you do, then you've created a very vivid picture, and then the reader can enjoy the story as much as possible. Now, imagery does not just apply to fiction, it actually applies to all literature. In fact, even when you're writing an essay for a class, like in your composition class, you want to use very precise language, and activate the five senses, especially if it's a narrative, if we're using a personal example, right? Because then it will have more rhetorical weight, right? It will be more effective in proving your point. So here is a poem, and we all know we've read Joseph Kamanyaka before, and we all know I love him. So I put an example from him too. And this is a poem he wrote that activates the five senses in the reader, or at least most of those senses, in order to get an emotional response from us. Facing it. My black face fades, hiding inside the black granite. I said I wouldn't, damn it, no tears. I'm stone. I'm flesh. My clouded reflection eyes me like a bird of prey, the profile of night. Slanted against morning. I turn this way. The stone lets me go. I turn that way. I'm inside the Vietnam Veterans Memorial again, depending on the light to make a difference. I go down the 58,022 names, half expecting to find my own in letters like smoke. I touch the name Andrew Johnson. I see the booby trap's white flash. Names shimmer on a woman's blouse. But when she walks away, the names stay on the wall. Brush strokes flash. A red bird's wings cutting across my stare. The sky. A plane in the sky. A white vet's image floats closer to me. Then his pale eyes look through mine. I'm a window. He's lost his right arm inside the stone. In the black mirror, a woman's trying to erase names. No, she's brushing a boy's hair. Okay. So in this poem, Joseph Kamanyaka is invoking the senses, and we can be where he is. Now, he does reference the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and it helps to understand what that is exactly. So if you don't know what that is, I would, encourage you to look it up. So the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is this really big wall of stone or granite, and it's got all of the names of the Americans who died in the Vietnam War, and it's imposing because there's so many names, and that's kind of the point of the piece, right? It's to be imposing. It's to make it very real how many people died there, at least how many Americans died there. Now there were many Vietnamese people that died that are not on that memorial, which maybe that would be a different memorial, and it would be just as devastating. In this one, so Joseph Kamanyaka, the speaker of the poem, he himself as well, is a Vietnam veteran, and he's at this memorial. And one of the striking things about this memorial is that it is like a mirror. It is so shiny and so reflective that when you walk up to see the names, you see yourself in the stone, right? Because it's like a mirror effect. And so he plays with that in this poem, especially at the end where he says, in the black mirror, a woman's trying to erase names. No, she's brushing a boy's hair, right? By erasing names, you see her hand moving, almost like it's swiping through the name. But actually, if he looks a little closer, he notices that she's not doing that. She's, brushing a boy's hair, and that's what he's seeing in the image, right? What's also sad about this is if it's a woman doing this, there's a chance that she may have been a wife or a relative of somebody in that that's listed in that memorial. And then maybe the boy then also is a relative. So note how he mentions how many names there are. That's a very specific number, 58,022, right? He's expecting to see his own name, right? Like he's surprised he's still alive. And he sees the letters in like smoke, like it's something that evaporates, like it was there 1 second and now it's gone the next. That's a very precise, specific, concrete image, right? When he touches a name, he doesn't say, I touched the name of a friend, right? No, he says he touches Andrew Johnson. We can see the name in our minds, right? And then he follows it up with a very specific image, the booby traps white flash. He doesn't say, I touched the name Andrew Johnson and I see the booby trap that killed him. Instead of saying that, he just gives us an image that stands in for that concept, and it's much more powerful. We see this white flash, and we know that death happened. Like that was the last of Andrew Johnson, right? So, this is a very powerful poem because of its imagery, okay? So here's another activity to kind of practice the concepts that we've been learning so far. Get a pen and paper and ask yourself that, imagine yourself in this scene, in this picture, right? Look at it closely. We've got some big buildings in the background. We've got, the very bright yellow and red. It looks like a festival. We've got red flowers everywhere, and we've got all these people, and even the people are wearing the colors of what's going on, right? It's bright, it's sunny, it's potentially hot. People are wearing short sleeves and hats and sunglasses, right? Now, because everybody is different, some people might view this and think, oh man, I want to be there right now. This looks like fun. Whereas some people might see this and go, oh, I hate the heat. Oh, they're so busy and garish. Oh, no, that's not my idea of a good time, right? So imagine yourself in this scene. Decide how you feel about your surroundings. Do you love this or do you hate it? Would you want to be here or not? And then write a list, at least one for each sense, right? So one for sight, one for touch, one for hearing, smell, and taste, okay? Write a list of at least one sensory detail that you notice in this picture. The ones you choose will be filtered through your bias as a person and help color your character, right? If a main character walked in here into this scene, right, they might complain about how hot the sun was. Oh, the 92-degree heat, burned my skin, right? Or, aggravated my skin condition, right? Or I started to sweat profusely. Whereas another main character might walk out into this scene and go, oh, I walked out of the freezing car out into the nice warm sun and I felt free, right? And I rose my face up to the sun, right? And it's a pleasant feeling, right? But that depends on the person. So write, a list of sensory details that you notice. Imagine yourself walking into this scene. Okay. So here's a few prompts to help, again, practice what we've learned in this lesson. You can describe something, a place, a person, an item, a behavior, or a holiday you deeply dislike. Do not mention yourself or use I. The key here is to see and choose details from an opinionated lens and use all the 5 senses. So I'm going to use I, right? That means that you can only rely on how you're interpreting an image and how you're relaying that to the reader so that they can understand that through imagery, they see how the writer or the main character sees the world. Or you can describe something you deeply love. Do not mention yourself or I. The key here is to see or choose details from an opinionated lens. Or write a list of specific words or phrases associated with either something, like a place, a person, an item, or behavior you hate or love. So if you don't want to go into specific description mode, right, maybe write a couple paragraphs, then you could just come up with some specific words and phrases that would do the same thing. In John Gardner's book, The Art of Fiction, which I highly recommend if you want to, practice fiction more, or you consider yourself a fiction writer, or someone who wants to be a fiction writer, this is a very good book. It's very hands-on and very practical. Okay. And it breaks down the elements of fiction very, very well. So in The Art of Fiction, Gardner speaks of concrete details as proofs, which establish in the reader such firm confidence that the author is an authority, that we will believe whatever she, he, they tells us. An author who is vague and opinionated, on the other hand, makes us uneasy and suspicious. Okay. So if you're vague, right, readers who read a lot, right, if you're vague, that's a trigger. To us, that means, oh, this person's trying to hide something, right? Whereas if you use specific details as a writer, the reader trusts you more. They know that they're in good hands because you are proving, you are earning the world that you're creating, and that, you're going to carry us, and we're going to be able to see the world from that main character's point of view clearly, right? So here I'm going to break down kind of this concept of showing versus telling. And you may have heard this before. If you take more creative writing classes, you will hear this over and over and over and over again. Okay. Beginning writers tend to be, they tend to tell. They just, what we would say tell, they'll just tell us what's happening, but not describe anything. Whereas in fiction and imaginative writing, you want to show as much as possible. Okay, so here is an example of somebody telling. Debbie was a very stubborn and completely independent person, and was always doing things her way despite her parents' efforts to get her to conform. Her father was an executive in a dress manufacturing company and able to afford his family all the luxuries and comforts of life. But Debbie was completely indifferent to her family's affluence. So this passage contains a number of judgments we might or might not share with the author, and she has not convinced us that we do. What constitutes stubbornness or independence or indifference or affluence? Since judgments supported by generalizations, we have no sense of the individuality of the characters, which alone would bring them to life on the page. Now, we're going to get a little bit more specific. Debbie would wear a tank top to a tea party if she pleased, with fluorescent earrings and ankle-strap sandals. Oh, sweetheart, Mrs. Chittister would stand in the doorway, wringing her hands. It's not nice. Not who? Debbie would say, and add a fringed belt. Mr. Chittister was artistic director of the Boston branch of Carden and had a high respect for what he called elegant textures, which ranged from hand-woven tweed to gold filigree, and which he willingly offered his daughter. Debbie preferred laminated bangles. So we have not passed a final judgment on the merits of these characters, but we know a good deal more about them than we did before. And we have drawn certain interim conclusions that are our own and have not been forced on us by the author. Debbie is independent of her parents' values, rather careless of their feelings, energetic, and a little trashy. Mrs. Chittister is quite ineffectual, and Mr. Chittister is a snob. Right? But maybe that isn't at all what the author had in mind. We weren't allowed to know what the author did have in mind, right? We've got a scene here. We've seen how these people are acting toward each other, but why or how? Who's even the main character, right? Okay. Now here is a third version where it's all showing. One day, Debbie brought home a copy of Ulysses. Mrs. Strum called it filth and threw it across the sun porch. Debbie knelt on the parquet and retrieved her bookmark, which she replaced. No, it's not, she said. You're not so old I can't take a strap to you, Mr. Strum reminded her. Mr. Strum was controlling stockholder of ready-wear conglomerates and was proud of treating his family, not only on his salary, but also on his expense account. The summer before, he had taken them to Belgium, where they toured the American cemetery and torture chambers of Ghent Castle. entirely ungrateful, Debbie had spent the rest of the trip curled up in the hotel with a shabby copy of some poems. Now we have a much clearer understanding of what stubbornness means, what independence means, what indifference means, and affluence, both their natures and values we are to place on them. This time, our judgment is heavily weighted in Debbie's favor, partly because people who read books have a sentimental sympathy with other people who read books, but also because we hear hysteria in the words like filth and take a strap to you, whereas Debbie's resistance is quite strong. Mr. Strum's luxuries are morbid and corrupt, and he uses his expense account for vacations, right? One trick, doesn't always work, but one trick or rule is to not use adjectives in your writing, right? So I don't know if you recall, but in the first example, you know, the writer who was telling used the words stubbornness, independence, indifference, and affluence, right? And instead of those in this third example, they showed what stubbornness means, what independence means, what indifference means, and what affluence means in a scene with dialogue based on what people would say, on the things that Debbie does, on the things that Mr. Strum does, right? So it's, what the people do that says a lot about them, not so much what somebody says that they do. Okay. So an adjective is any word you can put very in front of. So if you say Susan was very happy, we don't know what happiness means to Susan, right? We don't know how she acts as a person, and we would like to, right? Everyone who, when I'm happy, I act a very specific way. And when you're happy, you act a specific way. And the reader is reading because they want to get to know a person, right? And they want to know how they're acting. And if you just say they're happy, they can't see that in their minds. They can't see who this character is, and then they can't identify with them or care what happens to them. But if you put them in action, if you show when they're happy that they jump up and down like a child, then you're like, whoa, okay, maturity. Or if they're happy, they just give a slight grin. So we're like, okay, they're muted. They're trying to hide their happiness for some reason. They've got something to hide, right? Or maybe they, again, have an obscure, disturbing way, if they're half smiling at something bad and they're happy because something horrible happened to someone. Right now, we're getting to know this character even more, right? We're learning to not like them. Okay. So one trick to show not tell as much is to just take out all the adjectives. Maybe you write adjectives about your characters in a draft, but go through and take those adjectives and remove them, and instead replace them with what that means, right? Through scene, through description, through the 5 sentences. So here is another example of showing not telling. This is from Cat's Eye by Margaret Atwood. It's a novel. The cellar smells strongly of mouse droppings, a smell which wafts upward through the whole building, getting fainter as you go up, mingling with the smell of green dustbane used to clean the floors, and with other smells, the floor polish and furniture wax and formaldehyde and snakes. Okay, so in this example, we're given a series of smells from a child's point of view, but as those smells rise, we experience traveling upward through the building, also seeing the floors, the furniture, the snakes, right? So when we include details, usually we do so in some kind of order, right? In this example, the organization of the details of when they are revealed actually creates a sensation in the reader of us traveling upward, right? Notice the active verbs. So this is another mark of good writing, using specific verbs that are not linking verbs so much, or in the passive. So notice the active verbs and verbal phrases. The smells don't just lie there. They're active. They're active images. Avoid flat generalized writing such as to be verbs, linking verbs, and passive sentence constructions unless you have a specific reason for doing so, right? So again, notice these verbs. Smells strongly. Wafts upward. Getting fainter. They go up. they're mingling, they're used to clean, right? So all of these verbs are very active and the reader can see it happening in real time, right? Movement occurs through verbs. It's an action verb. It's an action word, right? And so if we use very strong verbs, then the reader can see it playing out like a movie, right? It makes things move forward. So here is an activity to help you take abstract terms and make them more vivid, more specific so the reader can feel it, not just be told it. Okay. So invent an image that suggests each vague word. For example, capitalism. Can you create an image that reflects or illustrates this concept of capitalism? In this example, it says the dotted line across Nevada, sign here, right? Or hunger. How terrible. This little blog of jelly has a mouth. Or shame. Okra in the gumbo. Perfect flower. Or pool of slime. Right? So you can pick any of these. I left 2 empty: freedom and joy. Is there a image that is invoked in your mind when it comes to freedom? When someone says freedom, what do you think? Right? Is it a positive or a negative association? Can you create an image that can relay this concept of freedom to the reader? Or joy, or hunger, or capitalism, or shame? Just invent an image that suggests these vague words. Okay. So concrete and significant phrasing. Concrete means that there is an image, something that can be seen, heard, smelled, tasted, or touched. So when I say use a concrete image, that is what I mean. Significant means that the specific image also suggests an abstraction, generalization, or judgment. So that concrete image will carry with it some emotions or associations. Detail means there is a degree of focus and specificity. So here's an example. Creature is a generalized notion. It's hard to see, except in the vaguest way. Animal is still vague. Four-legged animal is a little more specific. Domestic animal, a little more. Dog narrows the field. Mixed breed shepherd, we can totally see that. Old Sammy asleep on the red rug, his haunches twitching in his dream, brings the dog into sharp focus. If it had said his teeth bared and gnashing in his dream, we'd also suggest that old Sam has a capacity for meanness. Notice how narrowing the noun invites active verbs. Okay, so what's going on here is that the more specific you get in the precise word and phrasing that you use, right, the more associations come with it, the more it has a significant detail because it is so precise and so specific, right? Yes, mixed breed shepherd, we can see that, right? But who is this mixed breed shepherd? What kind of dog is it? Not just the breed, right? Old Sammy asleep on the red rug. Now it's an old dog with an identity, right? His name is Sammy. The way we name animals is very, like that adds color to an animal or a character, right? My cats are named Abby. I have a cat named Abby, and I have a cat named Ezra, right? Now, Ezra, he has some nicknames. I call him Barnaby Jones, and sometimes we call him Dum Dum, right? Because he's not the brightest cat. We joke that he's on the spectrum. He does very odd things, and he's kind of a jerk, right? Now, if I wanted to write up Ezra as a character, I wouldn't just say Ezra is a jerk, right? I would say Ezra puts his paws in the water and then scoops the water out and creates this pool of water, and in his delight, right, knocks the entire water bowl over. Then when I walk into the room, he just looks at me like, look what I've done. He doesn't run. He doesn't care. I might be yelling at him and he just stares at me and he's enjoying the entire scene. Now, Ezra is totally a jerk. But you see, what I'm, with the concrete details that you decide or that you choose, right, are going to determine the associations that come with it and how we understand the world and the people that you've inhabited in your story. So, some descriptions and, when you're showing it in telling, and some concrete images that you use carry with it an emotional state. So, in Anne Taylor's Accidental Tourist, she does just that. The dog, sighing, roused himself and dropped off the bed to pad downstairs behind him. The floorboards were cool underfoot, the kitchen linoleum cooler still. There was a glow from the refrigerator as Macon poured himself a glass of milk. He went to the living room and turned on the TV. Generally, some black and white movie was running, men in suits and felt hats, women with padded shoulders. He didn't try to follow the plot. He took small, steady sips of milk, feeling the calcium traveling to his bones. Hadn't he read that calcium cures insomnia? He absently stroked a cat in his lap, especially this one, a loose-strung gray tweed female who seemed made of some unusually dense substance. And the dog most often would be lying on top of his feet. It's just you and me, old buddies, Macon would tell them. The cat made a comma of sweat across his bare thighs. So ask yourself, what emotional state does this paragraph invoke for you? What comes to mind? For me, loneliness, right? This guy, Macon, is lonely, and his only friends are this cat and this dog. He's kind of lost in his world, right? He doesn't even follow the plot of the movie, right? And this is a pattern, right? The cat and the dog are used to this, and they take their places, right? It's something that they just do, almost like they're in a spell or something. They can't help themselves. So this is, it's kind of sad, melancholy, depression almost for me when I read this, although you might have a different emotional reaction. And again, this is the power of showing and not telling. You don't have to, you don't say he was depressed. You show it in this very specific instance. So we are aware of the generalization the author does not need to make because we'll make them ourselves. Okay. Tyler could have had her character tell us. The house felt eerie. I was desperately lonely, and neither the television nor the animals were really company. I thought if I did something sensible and steady, it would help, but I just felt trapped. When I tried to be cheerful, it got worse, right? You could have just said that, but it's not as good, right? Like when the reader reads, they want to be transported, and that wouldn't transport them anywhere. So here is a link to some examples in literature that, really drive home this idea of showing and not telling if you would like to know more. So note the following as we read. When you are reading stories or examples, right? Again, writers, we tend to teach ourselves, right? So we need a set of criteria that we need to keep in mind when we read so we can gain the most from our experience. So be mindful as you read. Be in tune with your emotional states and what you notice and don't notice as a reader. Be aware of what nouns and phrases the imagery invokes in your mind. If you're reading something and you wonder, how did this author create such an amazing picture or associations or an emotional reaction? Get a highlighter and highlight all the verbs. Get another highlighter in a different color and highlight all of the specific nouns. And it will become very clear to you how they did it. Be aware of the verbs and how they function. Be aware of the ideas and concepts the images and actions invoke. And work on your own definition of show and don't tell. For me, when I am learning stuff as a writer and I'm reading and I'm trying to gain experience from reading and learn from the authors that I love, I try to redefine certain concepts in my own terms and in my own way, right? And so that way I can pull it off in my writing, because sometimes people say stuff and it doesn't make sense to them. Like show don't tell that is such an overused piece of advice that it doesn't always make sense to everybody. And I'll even admit, when I heard it, I didn't always understand what it meant. Right. And so I had to redefine it for myself and in my way. When I'm writing, and I see an adjective, to me, that means I'm not showing, I'm telling. And that's my definition for myself. And then I go through and I change it. Right. I'm also very much into being accurate in my nouns, in my phrases. I'm very, visual. I'm a visual person, and that happens in my writing a lot, where I activate visual senses quite often. And there's sometimes disturbing images. And that's another thing that I do. But that's how I have defined show don't tell, is it comes through in those ways. So for you, when you're learning on your own, and you're reading examples, try to define it for yourself. What does it mean to you, show don't tell, when you read these examples? And the more you can define it for yourself, the more you can recreate it when you sit down to write. And lastly, show don't tell and overdoing it. There is a way to overdo it. And when you first begin, go overboard. It's better to do more than it is to do less, because you're practicing the more you can. There is, though, there is such a thing as overdoing it. The key is to know what's important and what's not, what images the reader needs to see to help them build the world your characters live in, and the ideas associated with the image you've chosen to share with the reader. Readers will fill in the blanks, though. Making morning coffee can reveal time, place, mood. But do we need to read 4 pages about making the coffee, breaking down each little movement that takes place to make coffee? No. So you don't want to go so overboard that you're including images that don't matter, right? You include the ones that are most important, right? You boil it down to the ones that have the best associations and that the most important for serving the story. But if they don't serve the story, don't include it. If coffee doesn't matter, why are we talking about coffee? If the state of the sky doesn't matter, don't describe the sky. Only describe the things that moves the story forward. And I would, if you want if you want an example of somebody who overdoes this, there is a book that I've read that the story was good, and the description drove me nuts, and I almost gave up on the book many, many times. It was called Wool. Okay, and it's just a sci-fi story. I really like sci-fi. But if you want an example of somebody who overdoes it and it's annoying and it gets old really fast, read that book. And then you get an idea of what happens when you over describe. Okay. Now that we talked about showing and not telling, let's talk about character. All of the elements are linked, but this one specifically is linked a lot with, the showing, not telling element of writing, because in a piece of fiction, everything is seen through a main character's eyes or multiple main characters, no matter what point of view you're choosing. So if you are choosing the third person omniscient, and again, we'll talk about point of view in the next week. If you're using third person omniscient, which is he, she, they, then, it's still usually linked to one main character and how they're seeing the world. And it's the adventure of one specific person. And, maybe some side characters, but mostly one person's desire and conflict and overcoming that conflict. And so they're linked. So the details that you choose and the associations that you choose are going to be linked to the person that you've chosen to write about, right? Again, like in that previous example earlier on in this video, treat every day like it's their birthday. Well, what would your character, how would they treat every day like it's their birthday? And then that's going to determine the details that you choose. So whenever you start creating a character, right, or a story, you need to create a character, and they are the central piece of the story. Right? If you're writing sci-fi or fantasy or genre fiction and you're creating a world, sometimes, writers will get stuck on this world building stuff and they'll never have a plot, and they'll never even have a character, or they're like almost like the world is the main character and not the person itself. And it's really hard for a reader to get into a story like that. And so you want to, when you're creating a story, you want to think in terms of, I am going to create a person with, goals and desires and a personality, and I'm going to make them as real as possible. And that's why people read, is they're reading because they're going to go on a journey with another person, and you're going to create that person and then put a bunch of stuff in their way, right? And that's the desire to read. So whenever we start a story, you want to start thinking of, who is this person? Who is the person that you're going to be writing about? And there's 5 general ways of presenting a character, or at least this is an easy way to understand how to maybe introduce a character or to show who this person is. Image, like what a person looks like, right? That can color your character. Voice, the kind of speech that they use. Action or thought. You can do so indirectly as well. And in this way, you are tailoring or interpreting as an author. For example, if you've read Lemony Snicket's A Series of Fortunate Events, you learn that the narrator themselves, the person telling the story, is also has a personality, that this is an actual real person, and that all of the characters are filtered through this narrator, right? So in a way, in an indirect way, the characters are being told through a narrator. So let's try and create a character for your story. What is this person? Say, imagine you were going to create a character that is this person specifically in the image, this older woman. What is her name? What adjective best describes her? How old is she? What does she do for a living? What does she want? What is her desire? Okay, and then you would have a sentence here that would include all of those elements. And this is a very simple way of starting out, figuring out who your character is by creating this sentence, right? If we did this activity, and I hope you do, I'm just going to make it up for you and to illustrate how it would sound. Olivia is a perky 94-year-old retired veterinarian who wants to save a litter of cats that were born in the, by the shed at the old folks' home that she lives in. There you go. Now we've got a character who has a desire and a plot for the story. And we even have a setting. So character as a desire, right? So Dorothy is an innocent 14-year-old girl from Kansas who wants to go home, right? She is essentially the embodiment of what she wants. The whole time in this story, she wants something and it's repeated. She just wants to go home, okay? Now, what makes Dorothy laugh? What would happen in this story to make her laugh? Note how what happens in the story is linked to the character themselves, right? What would make her laugh? Maybe her dog, right? Toto. What would make her wince? Oh, maybe if someone said something mean about her family. What would make her shout? Or gag? Or go quiet? Right? Note how, based on the character you've chosen, it will determine the events that happen in the story. Right? And then the character will react accordingly. Here's another character of desire. Batman is a very rich 40-year-old superhero from Gotham who wants justice. What makes this character giggle? What would make Batman giggle? Or wince, or shout, or gag, or go quiet? Right? Wince, someone might punch him. Right? That wouldn't be the same reaction from Dorothy. Right? Or shout. What would make him shout? The Joker did it again. Or gag, someone's literally choking him because he's in a fight scene. Or go quiet. Oh, they killed his girlfriend in this episode. I don't know. Right? So notice how the plot and the character kind of attached to each other. So let's try this again. In this picture, create a character out of this guy. right? Give him a name, an adjective. How old is he? A noun. And what does he want? Okay. And then determine what would make them giggle when shout, gag, or go quiet. How would they react to the world around them, and what kind of events would occur in the story about this person? So just get a pen and paper and write it out. Try to figure out who this character is. Character's image. You can introduce a character by what they look like. When a character is first introduced, it's important to let us experience that person through the senses, including sight, and it's often effective to emphasize the particular physical characteristic that can later remind us of the character as a whole. You don't have to describe the person down every detail. You don't have to do that. Maybe pick something memorable or interesting or quirky about that person. Okay? You know, what image is invoked when you see this person? Think of your best friend. Maybe when you see your best friend and you had to describe this person to somebody, what is the most defining characteristic of your best friend? If you could only choose one or two images to fully encapsulate who your best friend is, which ones would you choose? Right? Would it be the brand of shoe that they wear? Maybe they wear very expensive shoes. Maybe they wear ties to school every single day, or, Hawaiian t-shirts, right? Maybe, they have a scar, right? I'm not sure, but you don't necessarily have to go into every little detail, like what the color of their hair and all that. If all that doesn't matter, right? Maybe just pick a couple so that when you reference them again, right? You can bring that up, and then that becomes part of their character for the reader. This person, I feel, has lots of very defining qualities that any one of them you could choose, right? To reference this character. So ask yourself, what's in his waste paper basket or garbage? Note that it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical characteristic, right? What would you find there? Who is this character that you've created, right? We might ask ourselves questions to get to know the characters that we're writing about that never make its way into the story itself. But by knowing those things, it helps make us make certain decisions about what not only happens, but how that character is going to react to the world around them. Character is voice. You can use dialogue to advance plot through contradiction and subtext. I would not make the voice of a character very eloquent. That's going to draw attention to itself and after a while maybe annoy the reader. Don't make dialogue exactly how we speak, right? Sometimes we do in our stories, and that also distracts the reader. Don't use or right? We have the desire to do that because we want to make the world as real as possible for the reader, and so we try to simulate the real world. But if it's in writing, it actually doesn't do that. There's some effects in writing that go contrary to what happens in the real world around us. And dialogue is one of those things. So dialogue in fiction doesn't necessarily follow the rules of the world. Most times it does, but in this case, using and to signal what exactly a character is saying will just slow the narrative and slow the reader down. So there are some things in fiction that go contrary to what the real world would be like, right? And dialogue is one of them. Here's a couple of examples. Imagine characters saying this. I feel that civilization is encroaching on nature and that greed of the developers will diminish the value of our lives. Okay. They should lock up that builder. He's massacred the neighborhood. I remember how the lilac and wisteria used to bloom, and then the peonies and the daffodils. What fragrance in this room. But now, smell the stink of that site next door. It just makes me sick. Notice the difference, right? In the first one, it's almost like a summary, almost like a composition or an essay. Nobody would really talk like that. But in the second one, they would, and it carries with it the ideas of that first sentence. And we can definitely hear the voice of the character in that second example. This is one of my favorite stories. I read this story in my intermediate fiction class in college, and I've loved it ever since. And so I want to share it with you. This story embodies the idea of character as voice, where you could the voice of this character defines the character, right? And here's a link to the story. It's called After I Was Thrown in the River and Before I Drowned by Dave Eggers. And the main character is a dog. Okay. So here is the first 4 paragraphs of that story. And, note how you can hear the voice of this character immediately. Oh, I'm a fast dog. I'm fast. It's true. And I love being fast. I admit it. I love it. You know, fast dogs. Dogs that just run by and you say, damn, that's a fast dog. Well, that's me, a fast dog. I'm a fast dog. Whoo. You should watch me sometime. Just watch how fast I go when I'm going my fastest. When I really got to move for something. When I'm really on my way, man, do I get going sometimes, weaving like a missile between trees, around bushes, and then pop. I can go over a fence or a baby or a rock or anything because I'm a fast dog. And I can jump like a fucking gazelle. Whoo, man, oh man. I love reading this story. I love it. Note how there's no punctuation there. I love it. I run to feel the cool air cool through my fur. I run to feel the cold water come from my eyes. I run to feel my jaw slacken and my tongue come loose and flap from the side of my mouth. And I go and my name is Steven. I can eat pizza. I can eat chicken. I can eat yogurt and rye bread with caraway seeds. It really doesn't matter. They say, no, don't eat that stuff. That's not for you. It's for us, for people. And I eat it anyway. I eat it with gusto. I eat the food and I feel good and I live on and run and look at the people and hear their stupid conversations coming from their slits for mouths and terrible eyes. Ooh. So this is the world according to a fast dog. Note how the author really invoked voice here. You are in that dog's psyche. You were there with that dog and you know that dog loves to run, right? And it's embodied in the voice of this main character. And you can see how they see the world around them. How do they, this dog loves the environment. They love the feeling of running. They love being able to jump. Things are obstacles to jump over, right? And then note in the very end, he talks about people. How does he see people? Right? And it's like almost like people are disturbing creatures in themselves, right? They're not necessarily good characters. Anyway, it's a wonderful story. It's sad, but it's a very, very good story. And if you need any more convincing, note that squirrels are characters in the story too. So now you can't help yourself. You have to go read this. It's very fun. So sometimes characters are defined by their actions and discoveries and decisions. And, like I've said before, go through the slides. They have been uploaded to Canvas and just play this video. And it will show you how the way a person acts can define their character. The characters who interest and move us are those who are capable of change. If we grant that discovery and decision are the 2 agents of human change, characters will be in action when these are possible. Action as an action pact is a crude but effective way of getting discovery and decision into a work. Then there's also character as thought. What a character thinks determines kind of who this person is, and we get to know who this main character is by what they're thinking and how they're thinking. So a persona or character begins with a certain desire and therefore a certain specific goal in mind. Thought is the process by which she works backwards to decide what to do in the immediate situation that presents itself, right? So the world inside that character's head and how they're perceiving things and thinking about things and analyzing things are going to determine who this person is. And here is a skit from Hawkeye, the guy who plays Hawkeye. He does a little song about his character in the Avengers. So I would watch that definitely. It's really fun. But note how we have one idea of who Hawkeye is because he is a character of action, but his thought process makes him a very different person. Let's take the following example. Based on the details that the author has chosen to include for this main character, determine who this character is. Who is this character? Right? Like, how do they walk through the world, and how do we get to know them? This is from a very famous story called A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor, one of my favorite stories. She uses a lot of dark humor, and she includes usually a lot of depressing or disturbing things in her stories. And I really like dark humor, so maybe that's why I'm attracted to this author. Anyway, so I'm going to read this passage and ask yourself, what are the details? How did this author include what details so that you had this, you determined who you felt this person was. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connection in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the journal. Now look here, Bailey, she said. See here, read this. And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida, and you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. Couldn't answer to my conscience if I did. So I would say this character is mostly one of action, because she is using the story in the newspaper of a murderer on the loose to get what she wants, which is to go see, friends in Tennessee. She didn't want to go to Florida, which is where they were going to go on vacation. So in order to change her son's mind and say, no, we're not going to Florida, I want to go to Tennessee, right? Instead of just saying that to her son, she decides to use, and manipulate the situation by using a murderer in the newspaper. Oh, look, he's getting close to Florida. We shouldn't go there. And then using guilt, right? Like, oh, I wouldn't bring my family there. So he's talking about his children. And that she even takes the newspaper and whacks him on the head, right? Oh my God, this is a horrible person. This is a mean grandmother, right? And no, her name is the grandmother in the story. That's just her name. So note how through her actions and what she says, her voice, character's voice, right? We get to know who she is. Like, she's become a real person through the details that the author has chosen to describe the grandmother. Let's try another activity to, solidify kind of what we've learned. Cover 5 years in this character's life in 100 words. So in 100 words, include 4 qualities that this character possesses. Like, look at her and go, okay, in the next 5 years, how is she going to evolve, right? What 4 qualities does this character possess? 3 important events that have happened in the 5 years in this character's life. And 2 habitual actions out of habit, usually without thought or conscience, right? Maybe she's a smoker. Maybe she's anorexic. Maybe she sabotages her relationships, right? I don't know. Doesn't have to be bad habits, right? Or it could be. But, it's knowing these characters and defining their goals in life and their desires and their dysfunctions really make them become real. So in 100 words, include these elements to try to make her into a real person. Now, there are templates to characters. You can create a character based on a template. The famous one is from The Hero's Journey or the Monomyth. It is a theory by a guy named Joseph Campbell. It's called Armchair Literary Theory, where anyone can kind of access this. Joseph Campbell discovered there was a pattern in the stories that we tell, especially if it's a hero story, where a character goes through a certain definable things in a story, and they happen in almost all of them. They essentially, start in their world. They meet a supernatural being or some kind of helper that helps them go into this underworld, and then they learn a bunch of things. And they beat a big monster, and then they gain a boon of some kind, and then they come back to the real world and share what they've learned with their tribe, right? And this, a lot of books that talk about screenwriting use these elements in their story, and you can too. But what's really fascinating is that there are templates to characters in the hero's journey. In a hero's journey, you'll have a trickster, perhaps, or a temptress or a tempter. You'll have a helper character. You'll have a villain. You might have a monster of some kind, right? And so through these archetypes, you can create a character using ancient archetypes. um, so if you want to know more about this, please play this video, or you can just type in the hero's journey in Google and press images, and then the people have illustrated the concept of the journey of a hero. And we'll talk about this a bit more when we talk about plot next week. And that's one way to plot out the adventure of your character. But just know that it also comes with template archetypes, certain types of characters, and you can choose an archetype for your character if you'd like. You can define or determine a character by the conflict that they have to go through. Certain characters really lend themselves to this that we're familiar with. A character can be directly revealed to us through image, voice, action, and thought. If you set one of these methods at odds with the other, though, the dramatic attention will be produced, right? So for example, Harry Potter's story, and the conflicts in the story and how he sees himself is direct relation to the conflict he's dealing with, which is Voldemort. He doesn't want to be like Voldemort. He doesn't want to be bad or evil. And he sets himself apart from this evil person as much as he can, but sometimes doesn't always succeed. Batman and the Joker, right? You could argue that the Joker's messed up. He's evil, already kills people, all this stuff. But Batman causes a lot of damage. And he's willing to cause a lot of damage in order to stop this person, right? And so, again, he both of these characters, but Batman specifically, he has kind of like this conflict, right? Where how much violence is too much violence? At what point is, saving somebody not worth the violence that it causes the consequences, right? Is he a monster? Okay, so sometimes it's the conflict that can kind of drive the character or define the character for the reader. So here's another activity. Free write a short character sketch about the person below, focusing on how they make a living. Put your character in a working situation and let us know by a combination of direct and indirect methods what that work is, how well he, she, or they does it, what it looks, sounds, smells like, and how the character feels about it. Contrast the methods, right? So using this image below, what do you think she does for a living? What might she do for a living? Or you can give her a job that you wouldn't even think that she would have and see how she plays out in that scenario. That would make her definitely at odds with what's going on. It would emphasize the conflict that this character has to overcome and how she deals with the world when she's faced with conflict. Another way to help flesh out a character is to discover a core wound. Now, for those of you who are really into movies and screenwriting, this video is for you. This guy is what they call a script doctor. And a script doctor is somebody who you pay after you've written a script to go through your script and fix it and edit it so that it, you can try to sell it to a production company. Anyway, he does a lot of YouTube videos and stuff like that. And he's always trying to find business. But I did see a couple of things that he did that I thought were really, noteworthy in fiction. And one of his theories is that every character has a core wound. Even people do. And that kind of defines them and defines their goals and it's kind of like their concentrated desire. Uh, for example, if your character's core wound is physical, right? Maybe they have, a big burn on their face, right? Their core wound is that no one will love them, perhaps because of their appearance, and they're afraid of them, and they can't ever join, the social world and be human, right? And so that's something they have to overcome. In fact, that is the plot to a movie. Trying to think of what it was. I think it was called Pay It Forward, right? It was about I think it was an English teacher who had a big burn on his face, and he falls in love with one of his students' mothers. Okay. Um, so ask yourself, what is the core wound of your main character? Or think of a character that you like, and if you can identify their core wound. We've talked about Batman before. What is Batman's core wound? Right? He lost his family. Right? He lost his family. He's alone, and he's as a result from his core wound, he is obsessed with revenge and justice, and that guides him in his life, and compels him to go as far as he does, for justice, right? So note that the core wound defines the character, but also helps you determine what that character is going to do in the face of adversity. Can also help you figure out what is the adversity, what is the conflict that character needs to overcome. This is a rather long video. You may or may not be interested in watching it, but if you are, he's very illuminating. It's an interview with this guy. So what's your core wound, right? Ask yourself, what drives you as a person? Is it your parents? Did they do you wrong at some time? Some people, I have a very complicated family life that has defined me in many ways. How I go about my daily life is dependent upon how I was treated when I was younger. Is it some kind of injustice, right? Is your core wound having to do with love or failed love or lack of love? Is it fear of something? Note how all these are kind of negative. It is a wound. It is some way that we've been wronged or scarred or hurt. So that might not be for everybody. Not everybody would like to define a character that way. But we all hurt, and we all have some kind of flaw. And one good way of writing a character this way, about thinking of what their core wound is it makes them more realistic, right? Because no, I don't want to read a story about a perfect person. That's boring. That's not interesting to me. This is also why I don't understand people liking like the Kardashians, right? I've actually never seen an episode, but I've heard about them. I know what they look like. And to me, I think it's a ridiculous thing to watch, because they're not advertising their wounds. They're not advertising their flaws, I think. But I could be wrong. I don't watch those shows. But to me, that's what it is. And that's why partly I'm not interested. It's like, I don't need to see this perfect rich person on TV who cares, right? That's not interesting to me. I'd rather watch a character or a story about a person that's overcome some adversity, right? So in this activity, that if you can define your core wound, maybe all the pieces line together, you're like, oh my gosh, being treated that way by my brother growing up has really guided me. Like I make choices because this thing I'm obsessed over is, determining my choices. And then you could say, okay, what can I give my main character? Things that they have to overcome. So again, you can give them a physical wound, a defect or scar or condition causes real life complication, doubt, low self-esteem, and can make it difficult to feel like one fits in. Handicaps are real and can alter a character's path, limiting them and hurting their confidence. You could give them some injustice that they have to fight for. This is actually a panel from Batman. Being a victim of crime, witnessing a traumatic social injustice, or living in a time period or reality that is imbalanced or full of corruption will all leave a mark. It could be failure or mistakes. People are naturally hard on themselves when things don't happen as expected. The guilt associated with a failure or mistake, even if it is only a perceived failure, maybe they just think they failed, even though nobody else sees it but them, can paralyze a person and send them on an alternative life path. Misplaced trust or betrayal. Trusting or relying on someone and feeling let down in some way can cause deep hurt. This could be a parent or child dynamic, a friendship that goes sideways, or even a deep betrayal of a loved one, like infidelity. Isolation. If the character felt left out or isolated in the past, it has lasting effects. Isolation might be relationship related, a mother who favored a sibling over the protagonist, a power imbalance, educational or social status barriers, or even simple economics like living in poverty. That restricted opportunity, achievement, and fulfillment. Neglect, abandonment, or rejection. Some relationships are cardinal when it comes to caregiving, a parent and child, siblings, parents in a marriage, and to a lesser degree, a citizen and his government or her government or their government, parishioner and his, her, they minister, or a doctor and the patient. When the person in the caregiving role neglects or rejects the other party, this can cause deep feelings of abandonment to form. Disillusionment. Believing one thing to be true and then discovering it is a lie can shake a character to their core. This might be a worldview or political belief, discovering leaders that one has supported have been negligent or corrupt. A revelation in religious or spiritual beliefs or uncovering immoral behavior. It can also be something closer and more intimate, like a role model who was not who they pretended to be, or personal, like finding out one is adopted, for example. Okay. So there are many more core wounds that can drive your character and determine the things that perhaps happen to them or determine their desire and what they want in the story. Um, but you never really know until you to do that. You create a character and you give it something that it wants, and then you try to make it a real person. And there's all these tricks to making a character a real person. You can, again, think of a core wound. You can use an archetype or template. You can think of their name with an adjective, how old they are and what they do and what they desire. There's all sorts of strategies to make the character a real person with real qualities that have, that invoke all the sensory details and has them go through the story. And that is what readers love, is to be able to go through the character, through the story, and with a character that seems very, very real. There's yet other strategies that you can use. And this one I used quite often, and it's available to most people. Through COVID, maybe not as much. But there is a TED Ed talk you can watch. It's actually an animated educational video. It's really fun. It's essentially one way to figure out who your character might be, who your main character is, and that's by people watching. A lot of writers are people watchers. I am a people watcher. You are, you'll sit at a cafe, you have your notebook out, and you'll just sit and watch people and see how they act towards one another. You watch their body language, you listen to what they say, and you write it down. Like, who are these people, right? Somebody says something ridiculous or weird, you're like, who is that person? And you can create a character based on the world around you if you're just paying attention. So this is a fun video to watch, and it's a little tactic if you are able to be out in public, which is very hard to do now with COVID. But when it's all lifted, this video will, the strategy in this video will make more sense.